All right, so then moving on into chapter 6 in our discussion of Rudolf Steiner's analysis of the Gospel according to John. Chapter 6 is called the I Am. It's interesting, I like this chapter a lot because he goes back over some of his creation mythology, and some of it, when people read it, they complain about how obscure and weird it is. But I think I can make a certain amount of sense out of it here. So he starts off with this conversation that Jesus has with this rich man named Nicodemus, which occurs at night. And it says, Nicodemus said unto him, How can a man be reborn when he is old? Jesus answered, Verily, verily, I say unto thee, except a man be born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter into the kingdom of God. So, water and the Spirit. So then, Steiner now, what he wants to do is go back over his creation myth. Not all of it, just the earthly phase of it. He has 4 phases, a Saturn phase, a Sun phase, and a Moon phase. All 3 of those are astral. None of them have anything to do with physical matter whatsoever. Only the 4th phase is physical, and it's really the 4th phase that he goes over here, the Lemurian phase and the Atlantean phase. And I want to read some of this and illustrate it with some pictures here. This image here is the Earth about 4.5 billion years ago during the so-called Hadean epoch, when it's just a volcanic, fiery thing being bombarded. The late heavy bombardment comes in about 4 billion years ago. So let's listen to his description of the Lemurian epoch, which precedes the Atlantean. He says, let us suppose, for example, a thing in reality quite impossible, but we shall assume it for the sake of an understanding. Let us suppose that with your present senses, which of course you did not at that time possess, you could look into the latter part of the Lemurian and the first part of the Atlantean epochs of human evolution and observe the surface of the earth and its various parts. If you should expect to be able to find the human being upon the earth by means of this physical sense perception, you would be greatly disappointed. At that time he did not exist in a form which you would be able to see with your present physical senses. It would appear to you as though certain regions of our earth's surface, already resembling islands, protruded out of the rest of the still fluidic earth, which was either surrounded by seawater or enveloped in vapor. And here's a picture of the late heavy bombardment, which occurs about 4 billion years ago, where all of these asteroids come crashing into the Earth, and as they do so, they bring ice crystals with them that gradually melt, form pools of water, and pretty soon form the ocean. So this comes in at the transition from the Hadean to the Archean epoch. And then life appears pretty quickly thereafter, about 3.8 billion years ago. As you can see, the moon has already been extruded from the Earth, which is also a part of Steiner's cosmogony. And he says, but these regions which thus protruded like islands were not yet dry land like our present solid Earth, but soft earth masses in the midst of which fiery forces played. These island regions were continually being thrown up and then again submerged by the volcanic forces of that time. In short, there was still in the earth an element active in fire. All was still actively in a state of flux, continually changing. Okay, that sounds a lot to me. His description of the Lemurian period sounds a lot to me like what we know about the Hadean and Archean epochs of the earth and the gradual transition from a fiery Lemurian epoch to a watery Atlantic epoch, although if that is the case, and what I think is happening is that Steiner is dimly, intuitively picking up on the Earth's history in the same way that he can read the Akashic record to find out people's past lives. He's able to do the same thing with the Earth, but in a sort of Delphic oracle-like manner, let's say, a clairvoyant dream-like manner. And then let's see, so when the Earth commenced its evolution, it began by first repeating once more all the various earlier conditions. Every substance and every being in the cosmos always repeats earlier conditions at the beginning of any new stage of evolution. Thus our Earth passed quickly through the Saturn, Sun, and Moon states, that is to say, through a Saturn phase, which was a warmth phase, a Sun phase, which was a gaseous phase, and a Moon phase, which was a fluidic or watery phase. It recapitulates these phases on the physical plane. When it was passing through the Moon evolution, it consisted of water mixed with vapor. not like our present water, but a watery, that is to say, a fluidic condition of substance. The fluid state was its densest condition. This watery sphere which swam about in cosmic space was not like the water of the present, but water mixed with vapor. In other words, something gaseous and something fluidic permeating each other, and within this we find the human being. He could exist in this watery sphere because no solid substance had yet been precipitated. Of the present human being, only his ego and his astral body were present. But this ego and astral body, in other words, his spiritual components were present, but this ego and astral body did not yet feel themselves as separate entities, but as though embedded within the body of divine spiritual beings. They did not yet feel themselves severed from a being whose body is the water vapor earth. Then within these ego-endowed astral bodies, enclosures were formed, very tenuous, fine human germs. And these fine human germs, and he gives a little diagram here with this little central germ surrounded by a circle representing the astral body and the ego, sound a lot to me like the formation of bacteria, with the fine human germ in the center here. With and these are lighter bacteria, eukaryotic, they're nucleated, but nonetheless, the diagram that he gives is very similar to this. There's a central nucleus surrounded by what in his diagram is an astral body and an ego. Although the astral body and the ego are not independent, they're connected to divine spiritual beings. And then he says here, the next thing that occurred was the condensation of the water, and in a certain sense air and water appeared. No longer were vapor and water mixed together, but water and air were separated from one another. As a result, the human corporeality, physical and etheric bodies, again became somewhat more densified, and because the air had separated from the water, it became airy and took into itself the fiery element. Thus, what was formerly watery now became aeriform. The physical etheric human germ now consisted of air permeated by fire. So, in other words, the air becomes separated, and he has another diagram here. The air becomes separated from the fiery element, which sounds a lot to me like the oxygen catastrophe that occurred with the formation of photosynthetic cyanobacteria that created these huge colonies that are called stromatolites. They're like skyscrapers made out of cyanobacteria that are photosynthetic. And what they do, of course, is they take CO2 out of the atmosphere, and they just want that carbon. So they cleave it, and they let the O2, the two particles of oxygen, go up into the atmosphere. Gradually, it's turning the sky blue, but it's also containing, it's a poison, basically. It's corrosive. And so this is 2 billion years ago, with the shift at the beginnings of the Proterozoic now, with the oxygen catastrophe, and it sounds a lot like what he's talking about here, about the separation of air from fire air. Oxygen is a form of fire air. It's extremely flammable, and it's what makes it. It's what gives us warmth in our blood. And then, so he says, skipping over here some paragraphs, he says, the next thing that occurred was the division of the human being in respect of his physical body into airy, warmth, and fluid parts. This means, in an occult sense, that he became a water man. You may say that the human being was previously already a water man, but that would not be quite correct. Previously, the earth was a watery sphere, and within it, although only in a spiritual state, were astral body and ego. They swam about in the water as spiritual beings. They were not yet individualized. Now we have for the first time reached the point where we could have found the physical human body contained within this water, but in a sort of jellyfish formation. And so this sounds to me a lot like what is known as the Ediacaran period, which is just before the Cambrian explosion. This is about 635 million years ago, and we find the first jellyfish-type creatures floating about here. It's a rather boring-looking collection of multicellular organisms. Nothing terribly exciting, but nonetheless, it does sound like what Steiner is talking about here. What he's saying are these are the first human beings. He means they're beings, and they're incarnating in these kinds of the only physical forms that these early Earth environments made available to them. And then he says, it was only toward the middle of the Atlantean period And all this then is the Atlantean period. After the Hadean fire epoch, the Atlantean period then in Steiner would have to be very huge and take place over quite a long time, let's say from, 2 billion years all the way down to, let's say, the Paleolithic with the melting of the glaciers in 14,000 BC. It was only toward the middle of the Atlantean period that this human creature was dense enough to become flesh and bone. After the cartilage had solidified, the bones then gradually appeared, and then, of course, we get the Cambrian explosion. We get 540 million years ago, we get the appearance of the exoskeleton, we get the first fish, this little guy here named Pikaia, which looks to me very much like a transformed worm that has a primitive cartilaginous notochord that will eventually develop into a spinal column. We've got exoskeletons, and we've got organs that the cartilage will gradually harden, and in the next epoch after this, the Ordovician, we will have fish with actual skeletons. So we're well on the way here. And this, by the way, is an image of the planet during the late Cambrian, 514 million years ago, which, as you can see, was mostly water. It was the Panthalassic Ocean. And so you can get a sense then of all these continents during this whole period shifting around, moving around, some sinking, some rising. You can understand how intuitively the myths of both Lemuria and Atlantis could come out of dim perceptions of these rising and sinking continents. So this is, and then finally Steiner says, at the same time the earth also became more solid, and the human being then descended upon the surface of the earth, which of course would be the first of the amphibians that crawl up out of the water. This is Acanthostega, who crawls up out of the water at the end of the Devonian period, one of the first to do so, following the plants that have already marched out using lignin to create their vertical growth. Interesting. So I think that a lot of what seems murky in Steiner isn't murky. The more you know about Earth's history and the history of the solar system, the more of it you can sort of map on and take his dream transform version of it and interconvert it back and forth between the physical facts that we know about from science into his mystical dream version of it. And so all this is a backstory to that conversation with Nicodemus, where he says then that in that conversation about how a man, where Christ answers him and says, except a man be born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. He says, Spirit is actually pneuma, and it should be translated air. And if it were translated air, it would be, except a man be born of water and air, or vapor, he cannot enter the kingdom of God, because he says that eventually, since the human being condensed, the physical body anyway, condensed out of a water-air environment, eventually it will, after it's gone through its solid phase, through the history of Earth's evolution, it will do so again. It will rarefy, the human being will rarefy again into a water-air element to be able to be reunited with the gods, again in that sense. So it's a very long way of sort of answering that question, Nicodemus's question. And then he talks about how the individual human, initially the astral body and the ego, for a very long time, while all this physical etheric phenomena was going on the surface of the earth, the human astral body and ego was still part of the divine world, was still part of that, and had to split off from it. And in splitting off from it, these astral body and ego elements that eventually incarnated in physical form had to suffer a darkening of their astral consciousness, but an awakening of their daytime perceptual consciousness with the invention of organs like eyes and the brain and the nervous system and the senses and so forth, that darkened the astral element but awakened the daytime physical consciousness. And then so he says that the Son of Man really should be translated into the astral body and the ego, because the astral body and the ego, according to his cosmogony, come in later than the physical body. Paradoxically, during the Saturn phase, the astral Saturn phase, the physical body comes in as a subtle physical body, a unit, an egg of warmth, as he calls it. And then during the Sun period, the the etheric body comes in. So the physical and etheric come in first, and during the moon period they give birth to the astral and the ego, and then but those remain identical with the world of the divine until the earth period, when the incarnational process begins to get going. And so he says that with regard to the I am, the logos that Christ represents, he said that it would have been prophesied in the Old Testament with Moses and his conversation with Yahweh, when he's talking about, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring forth the children out of Egypt? And God tells him, don't worry, I'll be with you. And Moses said, well, what shall I tell them your name is? And God said unto Moses, I am the I am. Tell them that's my name, I'm the I am. So that's a foreshadowing of what Christ will later, as the Logos, incarnate as in physical form. The Logos, the I am, that will then make possible the separation and sundering of the human individuality from the group soul, the tribal soul. And it must be said that the planet's getting awfully small for group souls and tribal consciousnesses. It's getting pretty small for that. So the evolution has to develop. It has to move away from my tribe versus your tribe. That kind of mentality is outdated. All right, so we'll leave it there for discussion number 6 of the John Gospel.